full of that. So welcome to today's series. We had a series of speakers join us, and Dr. Jennifer Ho is closing us out with our celebration of Asian American history. And we just want you all to know that while we celebrate AAPI month or Heritage Month, that doesn't mean it's the end of the celebration. We must continue to create awareness in the work that we do and the spaces that we are a part of. So we are grateful that Dr. Jennifer Ho has agreed to share with us a little bit about what AAPI means, its origins, and its use as a label that combines Asian American and Pacific Islander into a single category. And she will also share a little bit more about the reason she embraces Asian American as a racial category of unity and solidarity. She will also share a little bit more about her family immigration story to the U.S. and a way to understand Asian American history and identity. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A where we all get to engage with Dr. Jennifer Ho. So before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Marisha, who is going to introduce Dr. Jennifer Ho. Marisha, thank you so much for being here. And by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. You're all welcome to call me Patricia, and I serve as the Assistant Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Our office is hosting today's event, the Office of Jedi with the College of Arts and Sciences. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Marisha. Thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marisha Lopez. I'm the Program Manager for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. And before we get started today, I just wanted to take a couple of moments to recognize the fact that we sit on land that is not our land. And we'd like to encourage everyone in their own time to check out Boulder's land acknowledgement, as well as a couple of other links we'll include for you in the chat: an ally guide, a campaign that you can sign, and a really excellent film on Netflix about food sovereignty. And so I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jennifer Ho. She directs the Center for Humanities and the Arts and is a professor in ethnic studies who specializes in Asian American studies. I'll put her full bio in the chat. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Ho.
Thank you for Marisha, and thank you, Patricia, and everyone. You should feel free to call me Jennifer. And I'm actually coming to you from the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area in California, which is home to the Ohlone people, who are still an active native population as part of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And so I do a land acknowledgement whenever I do workshops, in part because I really feel like if we're going to talk about issues of race and racism, then it's really important to start with the land that we're on. And the other thing is that if we're going to do land acknowledgements, in talking with sovereign nations, they really want to emphasize that reparations is what they are looking for. And while I do not have the capacity to return land as director of the CHA, I do have the capacity to offer fellowships. And that's actually something that the CHA is working on with the Center for Native and Indigenous Studies, is to offer a faculty fellowship to Native American Indigenous faculty. The other thing, especially for people in the University of Colorado system, you should know about is that the University of Colorado offers in-state tuition to the traditional sovereign nations of Colorado. So whether you are in Berlin, Germany, or Atlanta, Georgia, you can attend CU Boulder for in-state tuition. And there are lots of people who are actually trying to work on the Colorado system so that one can enroll for free if you're a member of the sovereign nation of of the traditional territories of Colorado. Okay, so that's all to start. I've got a PowerPoint. I'm going to try and do this quickly so that we do have time for Q&A. Let me screen share. And if I could I'm hearing some background noise, and if people can just mute themselves, that would be very helpful for me. Thank you very much. Okay, so the title of my talk is Asian American History, Identity, and How to Be an Anti-Racism Advocate. I'm going to put some links in the chat when I'm done with the presentation. And if you are on Twitter, you can follow me at Dr. Jen Ho on Twitter. So I told Patricia and Marisha, I just wanted a very brief introduction, right? Because I think the most salient information in terms of University of Colorado Boulder is that I'm a professor here. I direct the Center for Humanities and the Arts. And in terms of my own professional expertise, I am an Asian American Studies, critical race studies scholar, and the former president of the Association for Asian American Studies. I also have some personal experience with this topic because I'm the daughter of a refugee father from communist China and an immigrant mother from Jamaica whose own parents, so my grandparents on my mother's side, were immigrants from Hong Kong. So here's the roadmap for this talk. I'm going to first define terms like Asian American and Pacific Islander and kind of talk a little bit about May being Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'm then going to turn to my family's immigration story, because one of the things I found is that rather than kind of give you some basic facts and historical examples, that if I talk about if I share a narrative, right, my family's narrative as a way to talk about Asian American history, I think it kind of sticks with people a little bit better. So I'm not being egocentric and sharing my family story, but trying to do it as a way of sharing a narrative, one family's narrative, and then seeing how that overlaps with Asian American history. And I will end with the work that I've tried to do, particularly since I've come to Boulder and since the pandemic has started, to address anti-Asian racism, which we saw an exponential rise of starting in April 2020. Oh, wait, one more thing. So you should be wondering, why am I seeing a picture of a corgi? That's actually my dog Chaucer. Studies have shown that when you include a picture of a cute animal, when you have a slideshow, that people are more apt to pay attention, because this picture is going to pop up every now and again, so you can kind of wait to see when is the corgi going to come back. Okay, so let's begin with Asian American and Pacific Islander. So the first thing that we have to know is that these are both geographic and political terms. All racial terms are political, and I don't mean in terms of electoral politics, like who votes Republican and who votes Democrat. I mean political as in they have political meaning. They are created by people. And they are linked to issues of power. And so Pacific Islander gets lumped in with Asian American during May as a way to recognize Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, because people think that Pacific Islanders optically look, right, like they have features that are similar to Asian Americans. And that partly has to do with the history of Hawaii and other Pacific Island nations in an area that is now known as Pacifica. That's kind of demarcated into three areas: Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. And I'm spending a little bit extra time talking about who Pacific Islanders are, because the rest of my presentation is really going to be focused on Asian Americans and my own family story as Chinese Americans. I think in May, we start with Asian Americans and we add on the Pacific Islander. And particularly for those who are Pacific Islander identified, I think they feel May is an erasure, actually, of their particular heritage and their issues, which are really more akin to American Indian indigenous issues, because we have to begin with settler colonialism. So I want to really center that and have us maybe rethink, when we talk about Asian American Pacific Islanders, are we actually talking about Pacific Islanders? Because I'm not going to be talking mostly about Pacific Islanders and sharing my story, since I'm not Pacific Islander identified. And I'm sharing that not to exclude Pacific Islanders, but just to be sort of honest about what this presentation is going to be about. I'm also not going to talk about South Asians really, or Southeast Asians. I'm mostly going to be focusing on my own story as an East Asian American. And that's also part of the problem, we could say, or challenge for talking about Asian American and Pacific Islanders, because Asian American as a racial category encompasses over 30 different countries. And if you add Pacific Islander, that number now increases to 50, over 50. So the whole category of Asian American and Pacific Islander encompasses people whose heritage and ancestries come from over 50 different nations, countries, languages, customs, cultures, histories, experiences. It's very diverse. So even a term like Asian American, which we think, oh, we know who Asian Americans are, you actually don't, right? That most of the time, I think we substitute the experiences of a small group of people, Chinese Americans, for example, or East Asian Americans, for the totality of an Asian American experience. So the next question is, how did this term even come about? So the term Asian American was actually a term that's newly created out of activism by two UC Berkeley graduate students who were looking for a term that would unite student activists in the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly those who were involved in the Third World Liberation Front, who were striking for ethnic studies at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, and who were also participating alongside Black and Chicano activists to fight for Black civil rights, to fight for Mexican American rights, and who were joining together in class solidarity and against the war in Vietnam. So there were a host of these kind of social justice issues that were emerging in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's when people of Asian descent who were in the United States, who had US citizenship, wanted a term to really unite themselves. And it was predominantly Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino and Korean activists in the late 60s, early 70s, who worked for this fight for social justice. And so that's also why the term Asian American is really inherently a political term. When it was created by these activists, they thought it was going to be a temporary term used to unite people and then discarded once their aims were met. It was really the 1980s that turned Asian American into a census term and demographic term, because that's also when Asian American Pacific Islander Month began recognized by the federal government. I think it started as a week and then eventually became a month. Okay, so that's the kind of preliminary information. Happy to answer more questions during the Q&A. I'm going to start now with my family story. So we begin with Chongqing, which is where my father's family is from, the Ho family. That's my grandmother. So in Chinese, you have different terms for grandmother on your mother's side versus father's side. My nanai is my grandmother on my father's side. You can tell by her wedding dress that she came from a fairly wealthy family. This would have been considered a Western style wedding dress. It was white, it wasn't red. And she has this lavish headdress and this lavish floral display, this bridal bouquet. So my grandmother was this Shanghai wealthy woman who married my grandfather, who was an international banker who spoke 8 different languages. They were a very wealthy family. And the communists were fighting the Chinese National Army. And there was a lot of turmoil. So my grandfather, because he had political connections and he had financial connections, pretended to take the family to visit my grandmother's sister in Macau, which was a Portuguese colony at the time, and walked away with from their home and their servants and everything they knew, never to return. They spent 7 years wandering around Macau and Hong Kong and ended up in Taiwan without any money. They had spent all their money. So then they had to decide, are they going to stay in Taiwan or are they going to reunite with the eldest daughter who had married a Chinese American Baptist preacher? They chose the latter route, and in part, they were able to choose the latter route despite various discriminatory acts preventing immigration of Chinese to the United States, because in 1953, the US government passed the Refugee Relief Act, and it was initially meant to target refugees from communist Germany. But they actually allowed for 2,000 spots set aside for Chinese communist refugees. And so that's how my family were able to be sponsored and to end up in New York City, Chinatown in 1955. So my grandfather went from being an international banker who spoke 8 different languages, who was very wealthy and was used to commanding rooms, to being reduced to working under the table in various businesses in New York City's Chinatown. And my grandmother, right, who never worked a day in her life except to order around servants, was making piecemeal jewelry at the kitchen table as a means to support her family. So my father's family is kind of a classic immigrant refugee story of being wealthy in your family, in your country of origin, and then reduced circumstances when you move to the United States. And that is a picture of me with my nanai and my yeye in New York City. So now we turn to my mother's family. So my mom likes to joke that I'm aristocratic stock on my father's side and peasant stock on my mom's side. So the Yap family, my mom's family, came from the New Territory region, just south of the Chinese border. And they were poor farmers. My grandfather, my Gong, was the fourth son. So he's the fourth of 5 children. The eldest son inherited the meager farm. The second son went to Jamaica because at this point in time, Hong Kong is a British colony just like Jamaica is. So he goes to Jamaica, he opens up a shop, and then he sends a ticket for the third son, his third youngest brother, to join him. But the third brother has fallen in love and doesn't want to go to Jamaica, so he hands his papers and his ticket, because this is before TSA, right? And passport control and everything, to my grandfather, who goes over to Jamaica, helps run his brother's business, and then branches out on his own and opens up the Caribbean Bakery, which makes Caribbean baked goods. And then because of the cultural and social norms at the time, he goes back to China to find a wife, because while it is not illegal to marry a woman of a different race, it's certainly not the expected thing to do in the 1920s in Jamaica or in China for that matter. So he goes back to China, finds a matchmaker, meets my grandmother. After 30 days, which seems shockingly short to me, they are married, stays long enough to get her pregnant. Then he goes back to Jamaica to continue running his bakery. My grandmother gives birth to their eldest daughter. And after the eldest daughter is like about 3 months old, leaves her with the youngest sister, with my grandfather's youngest sister. And then my grandmother gets herself from New Territories region to Kowloon Harbor, like on a truck. And from Kowloon, she boards a boat to traverse the Pacific Ocean, and she lands in Vancouver. She is detained in Vancouver for 2 weeks because, similar to the United States, Canada had discriminatory laws believing that Chinese women were diseased and needed to be held in quarantine because they didn't want them to bring disease into the country. If she had landed in San Francisco, she would have been kept in Angel Island Detention Center, possibly for much longer than 2 weeks. So at least in Canada, she was only there for 2 weeks. In the US, she could have been there for like 2 months or even 2 years. So there were sometimes people in Angel Island detained for years. So my grandmother, when she leaves detention, takes a transcontinental train to Nova Scotia, where she boards another boat that takes her to Kingston, Jamaica. The entire trip takes 3 months, and she has motion sickness for the majority of the trip. While in Kingston, World War II has broken out. So they cannot send for the baby daughter until the end of World War II, until 1946, when she's a teenager. And so she refuses to come and join the family in Kingston. So my grandmother grows up estranged from her eldest daughter. It's a very sad story. They're not reunited until my eldest aunt is an adult and has children of her own. Meantime, my grandmother has 8 kids total in Kingston. So this photo that features my mother is only a partial photo of the full 8 children that were born in Kingston, Jamaica. And my mother at this time, even though she's technically the second eldest daughter, for all intents and purposes is the only eldest daughter, which means that the bulk of the domestic chores fall on her and my grandmother because of the gender norms at the time. This is my mother at the age of 17 when she graduates. And again, because Jamaica is a British colony, she is able to go and get her nursing degree in Guildford, England. So if anybody's seen the show called The Midwife, like that story, the storylines, there's like a storyline of a nurse from Jamaica, like that's my mom's storyline. Except she didn't remain in England. She went back to Jamaica, worked for a year. And then in 1966, and this is a crucial year, she hears that there's a job in Beth Israel Hospital in New York City. And because in 1965, the Immigration Act had just been passed in the US that did away with the previous restrictive laws, she's able to get a job and move to New York City, where she goes on a first date with my father at the Transfiguration Catholic Church in New York City's Chinatown. And 9 months later, which is shockingly soon to me, they are married in that same church. So this is a picture of my mother and father on their wedding day, my Uncle David and my popo, my mom's mom. That's us in Flushing, New York. I'm rocking the 70s hairstyle. And that's my younger brother, who's 3 years younger than me. We're about to move. I'm 4 years old, and we're about to move to Hayward, California, which is actually, I am sitting in, this is not a picture of my parents' house, but this is exactly like the ranch style home I grew up in and where I'm currently talking to you from. And then that's me with my brother and my cousin Greg and my younger cousin Janine, growing up in the 1970s in Hayward, California. So we were, I would say, a working class family, right? I mean, I never grew up hungry. I always had food, I always had clothing, but there were certain things that were considered luxuries, like books. Like, I didn't really understand that you could have your own personal library. I thought this was something that only rich people could have, until I really went to college and understood that people grew up in different economic circumstances. And so we went to the public library every week. And this is the actual week's public library that we would go to. And I would check out books every Saturday, and I would return books, and these are a selection of some of my favorite books. And one of the things you'll notice is that none of these books are Asian American books. Which is fine, right? Like, I loved these books. I still love these books. But I share this with you because what I was told indirectly, right, as a child who wanted to write, was that I could not write a book about myself as a Chinese American growing up in California. That if I was going to write books, I had to write books as a white person, because all the books I read were written by white people, whether in the United States or Britain, about white experiences. And so it wasn't until I was a student at UC Santa Barbara and I took my first Asian American Studies class, and I read the very first Asian American book that happened to be written by a Chinese American woman, Maxine Hong Kingston, about growing up Chinese American in Fresno, California. And that book changed my life. Sorry, Stockton, California. That book made me realize that you could be Chinese American and you could write books about Chinese American experiences. And from that book and from that class, I decided that I wanted to learn more about who Asian Americans were. This class also introduced me to the Refugee Relief Act of 1953, and it was the first time that I saw my family reflected in US history. And that was enormously powerful for me. It is one of the reasons I am an ardent supporter of teaching ethnic studies in the K through 12 system, because to grow up without seeing yourself reflected in the curriculum you are learning about, I think, is a very poor thing. So we are jumping way ahead because I want to get to the Q&A. So from my first Asian American Studies class, I graduated with a degree in English. I went to get my PhD, where I wrote my dissertation on Asian American coming of age novels and food. I wrote my second book on Asian American identity, racially ambiguous identity, about mixed race people and transracial adoptees and other people that we would say are kind of ambiguously racially figured. I got my first job at UNC Chapel Hill. I then moved to University of Colorado Boulder in 2019, where I became director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts at the same time that I became president of the Association for Asian American Studies. There was a lot happening. I was super excited. And then we, of course, remember that in March of 2020, our entire world shuts down with the COVID-19 pandemic. We also start hearing from the highest reaches of government, people like Donald Trump and his administration saying that COVID-19 was caused by China and Chinese people, and using phrases like Chinese flu, Wuhan virus, and the most obviously racist Kung flu. What we also saw happening, particularly starting in April of 2020, but I would say it probably had happened much earlier and historically in the United States has never stopped, is the targeting of Asian Americans, associating them with disease. So you remember when I talked about my own grandmother's story, that she was quarantined for 2 weeks because they believed that Chinese women were diseased. That belief stemmed from the immigration of Chinese women to San Francisco, California, in the wake of the gold rush in 1849. And the reason people thought this was that Chinese women came into the United States, to San Francisco, California, because they were trafficked. They were sex trafficked into the United States. A very small minority were brought as wives or daughters, but the majority of Chinese women who found themselves in the US were tricked into sexual servitude, which still happens to this day. They were told in Hong Kong that there was a job waiting for them as a maid, a domestic worker in San Francisco. They arrive in San Francisco and they're told that job isn't there for you anymore, and you have to pay your travel, the boat fare, and the food you ate. And so the only way to pay us back is by working as a prostitute. And so, of course, these women became diseased. They had venereal diseases. Some were very badly mistreated. Some had to have sex with men, up to 100 men a night. So of course they became malnourished. So this association in people's minds of Chinese women with disease and immorality gets solidified in the mid to late 19th century. And it spreads throughout North America. And so of course, it's not surprising when we get to the 21st century and there's this disease coming out of China that people immediately go to this idea that somehow Chinese Asian people are inherently diseased. And we saw incidences of violence, spitting, name calling, hitting, and then very fatally in Atlanta, a man shot 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. A month later, there was a shooting in Indianapolis of South Asian Sikh workers. And there have been various attacks against Asian elders, some of which led to their death. This has also led to anti-racism advocacy. And so because I was president, I was doing a lot of interviews, and I was asked to do an opinion piece for CNN after Atlanta. I've been interviewed by various Colorado outlets about critical race theory, and I was interviewed by NPR and other news outlets trying to educate people about anti-Asian racism. And that's it. Sorry, that's kind of an abrupt ending, but I guess I really do want to get to Q&A, and I'm not exactly sure how much time I've spent. This is a short list of further reading. I'm happy to share that with people. Oh, I did this really quickly because we've got 30 minutes. Okay, good. So I can put some resources in the chat, and I'm also happy to answer questions. I think the last thing I want to say before turning this over to Q&A is that I am not a remarkable person. I'm not trying to be humble. I just really mean this. I am not a remarkable person. I have a certain level of education. I have a certain level of dedication to this topic. But what I feel most fervently is that all of us can choose anti-racism. And so while I've concentrated, because it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, on experiences related to Asian Americans and experiences related to my family and things that I've gone through, I can't talk about anti-Asian racism and how to combat anti-Asian racism without also talking about how we all need to combat racism and white supremacy, because really the root of racism in the United States is white supremacy. And I know one of the things I got asked about when I was being interviewed by various news outlets during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, because some of the attacks were happening against Asian women by Black men. And those videos tended to go viral. I think possibly and probably because in the United States, because of the anti-Black racism that exists, we associate very quickly criminality and violence with Black men. And so when I was interviewed by various news outlets trying to talk about tensions between Black and Asian people, one of the things I tried to do was to actually say what I just said to you, right? That news outlets are quick to pick up on this because of the anti-Black racism that exists in our society that has caused us to buy into this narrative of Black criminality, which really starts during the Civil War. And that's a narrative we need to fight against. The other thing I say is that while it's true that there has been tension between Asian American and Black Americans, right? There are individual instances that are truly horrific in terms of the murder of Latasha Harlins in Los Angeles. We also don't do enough to really talk about the very robust and very real moments and incidences of solidarity. One of the most famous, especially because we're in Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, is the friendship between Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama. They happen to share the same birthday, May 19th. Yuri Kochiyama was in the Audubon Ballroom when Malcolm X was assassinated, and there's a very famous Life magazine picture of her cradling his head. Yuri Kochiyama, Japanese American whose family, she was incarcerated during World War II, and really made social justice her life's work. So not even just in terms of the work of Malcolm X, but she continued to do work around prison abolition for the remainder of her life. And then I think there are we don't remember, of course, that we have mixed race people who are Black and Asian. The most famous of which is Kamala Harris, right? That Kamala Harris is both Black, Jamaican, and South Asian, Indian American. And so I try to really remind people that there's actually a level of very prosaic solidarity between Black and Asian people who fall in love and have children, right? And that these are also the stories that we need to tell, that if we're constantly, I'm not trying to sweep under the rug tensions and challenges and violence and very real anti-Black racism that exists in the Asian American community. That's very important to be owned and to be addressed. But I also think if that's the only narrative that we focus on, if we're constantly talking about there's tensions between Black and Asian people, it really ignores other narratives that quite frankly have always been with us, but that we just aren't focusing on. Like Grace Lee Boggs, who is a Chinese American woman who fell in love with a Black American man, Jimmy Boggs. They moved to Detroit, and she made the Boggses as a couple made it their life's work to really address issues of poverty and issues of racism in their Detroit neighborhood, and address education. And so I feel like that's part of my work as an educator, as someone who focuses on Asian American and critical race theory, to really uplift these stories while also not pretending that the anti-Black racism that exists in the Asian American community doesn't exist. And to really kind of challenge Asian Americans to rethink the model minority myth. So that's where I'll end, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'm going to put resources in the chat.
Thank you. So we're just going to invite folks to use the chat. If you have any questions, you can private message Marisha, myself, Jennifer, or you can also unmute yourself, raise your hand. We also invite you to use reactions, so the emojis. And then if you just have thoughts, right, you just want to share something with Jennifer that spoke to you, that inspire you, this is a good time. So we're going to invite you all to just have this conversation. I just want to get started. Jennifer, we had someone privately message to say, what is the model minority? Can you tell us more about it? And how does that look like today in US universities?
Oh yeah, no, thank you for the model minority question. In fact, I'm not great at doing two things at once. So the model minority myth is a myth. And that's maybe the first thing I should start with. And so it's this idea that somehow Asian Americans are more successful than other racial minorities. That Asian Americans are good at math, they're high achieving. I'm putting a link to a video about the model minority myth. I was asked to do actually like a PSA video about debunking the model minority myth during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's part of the YouTube video there. It begins in the late 1960s with William Peterson, who writes an article called Japanese American Success Story in the New York Times Magazine. And in the article, he's praising Japanese Americans who willingly went into concentration camps during World War II to prove their loyalty, and then submissively left the camps when it was time to be over, didn't pass on Japanese language or customs to their children, only taught them English and American, and they therefore could assimilate better into the United States, right? And so he saw this as a success story. In the middle of the article, he actually says directly to Black Americans, right? Because this is 1968, he says, why can't Black people be more like the Japanese? Like, why are Black people protesting for their rights? They should just act like the Japanese and assimilate into the United States. That's part of the model minority myth, right? That's part of the myth, is saying there are good minorities and there are not so good minorities, i.e. bad minorities. We're going to praise the good minorities for staying in their lane, for being quiet, for being passive, for, but what we really mean to do is to disparage Black and Mexican American, Latine, Indigenous American, Native American people by praising Asian Americans. So for example, I'll give you, and I'm going to get political, so I don't mean to offend anyone, but I'm being electorally political. So in this last week, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill in Florida mandating Asian American studies being taught in K through 12 schools. And it was part of an organization called Make Us Visible, which is an Asian American organization that has chapters in different states, including this one, trying to lobby for the inclusion of Asian Americans into K through 12 curriculum. On the surface, that sounds great, right? Like, why would I think that that's a bad thing? Like everything else, and that includes me, right? I don't speak for every Asian American. Like, I'm giving you my experiences as a single Asian American person, partly born out of my expertise as an Asian American studies scholar. Make Us Visible is not run by any Asian American educators, meaning they are Asian American identified, but they don't have experience teaching Asian American studies. No one in the leadership of Make Us Visible is an Asian American studies scholar, has taught Asian American studies in K through 12 or college level. They have a particular agenda of wanting to uplift Asian Americans by uplifting positive stories of success, of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, of Vietnamese refugees coming over here penniless, not knowing the language, and then being a success story. What they are doing is replicating the model minority myth. And in so doing, saying we are the good minority and tacitly implying that other minorities are not so good. So, it's worth considering why in Florida, this bill passed so readily and was signed so readily by Ron DeSantis, when there are so many book bans happening in Florida, where you're not allowed to talk about gay LGBTQ content, and where the AAPI test for African American studies has also been critiqued. That is a model minority move. What Hypervisible is doing, along with Ron DeSantis, is saying, here's the good, like, we don't want to be racist in Florida, right? We don't want to look like we're white supremacists. So we're going to uplift the stories of these good, hardworking Asians, which, by the way, are one of the fastest growing voting blocs in the United States. So this also has a certain type of political component, right? In terms of making it seem like you want to uplift Asian Americans. The other thing is that, when you start to disaggregate data, right? Because I began by saying, like, Asian Americans encompasses over 30 different groups. And something, and again, I don't mean to put Craig on the spot, but something that I think I know about University of Colorado Boulder is that there is a fairly sizable population of Asian immigrant and refugees who clean our offices, right? And I don't think people really fully know that, like, which makes sense, because if you're not around when you see these Burmese women and men who are cleaning our offices, you may not kind of understand who they are. This is actually not unique, I would say, to University of Colorado Boulder. When I was at UNC Chapel Hill, 50% of the night cleaning staff were Burmese refugees. And so if you are a Burmese refugee, you have among the lowest high school graduation rates in the United States, lowest English language literacy, which is why house cleaning and housekeeping becomes a viable option for you as a refugee in the United States. You don't need a lot of English language to clean an office. And it also means that you have some of the lowest graduation rates. Lowest college matriculation rates, right? So if you're a Burmese refugee and you're cleaning offices at the University of Colorado Boulder, it doesn't mean that your children will necessarily be guaranteed to be going to college in the way that people automatically assume that if you're Asian American, you're this model minority, your kid is super smart, you're going to go to college. And that's part of the problem also with the term Asian American, is that, you look at statistics and you see Indian American, Chinese American, Korean American are some of the three groups that in terms of our student populations are very high achieving, right? but Burmese and Laotian and Vietnamese and Cambodian have very low college matriculation rates nationwide. And so that's also something that we really need to keep in mind when we think about the diversity of Asian American, that the model minority myth erases real challenges based on class and refugee status for some Asian populations. Craig, I don't know. I know I called on you. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the staff that you've worked with.
Well, the staff at the university currently, at one point, the Spanish community was the largest that was being employed. Currently, it's the Nepalese.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of how the population has shifted. We also have Tibetan, Lao. Hindu is now being introduced as well as one of the languages that we are thinking about adding to the actual population.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, and I think, again, I think we're better off knowing this about who are our colleagues in the university, right? Great. Thank you, Craig. Mitzi.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your talk, and that was wonderful hearing about your family. I actually had two questions. Maybe you can just pick which one you want to answer. One was about what some similarities and differences are between anti-Asian American racism versus anti-Black and anti-Hispanic racism. And then the second question was, I was curious what you were thinking about the lawsuit that was brought against Harvard and some other schools. I actually don't know that much about it, but it revolves around questions about past racism against certain types of groups and merit, and was wondering what you thought about that too.
Yeah, because you are the only person with their hand up, I'm happy to answer both questions succinctly as much as I can. I also wanted to flag, I just put in the chat a link to a free 3-week Coursera course. So this was a course that the CHA, Center for Humanities and the Arts, along with people at University of Colorado, Denver, received a grant from Asian American Advancing Justice and the Kaiser Foundation to educate people about who Asian Americans are and to address anti-Asian racism. And I will say it really is a course that does that, but it really also focuses on the things I was talking about in terms of addressing racism writ large. And so that gets, Mitzi, to your first part of your question, which is, I think the commonality that Asian Americans, Latine, and so I'm using by the way, just as a FYI, what I'm saying is the word Latine instead of Latinx, because increasingly, at least in scholarly circles, right? And I'm an academic, so I follow scholarly conversations. The preference is to use a plural form that recognizes the multiplicity of genders. Whereas if you say Latinx, Latinx, technically speaking, is referring to somebody of Latin American descent who's non-binary and potentially transgender, right? Or gender inclusive. And then Latino would be for someone who's male identified, and then Latina would be for somebody who is woman identified. So the term Latine kind of encompasses all those gender identities. So what all of these groups have in common in the United States is white supremacy. And I want to be really clear about this because race and racism are actually terms that don't travel well. So what I'm talking about is I'm talking really specifically about the history in the United States. Even though Canada, like people like to joke, oh, Canada's the 51st state, like Canada has its own particular racialized history. And I would say that the treatment, particularly of Indigenous sovereign nations in Canada, is perhaps more akin to the way that the United States has treated Black Americans, which is not to say that I'm trying to rank oppression, but only to suggest that there is a different racialized history happening in Canada than the United States, than in Mexico, which has its own racialized history that is complicated around indigeneity and the transatlantic slave trade with Black people into Mexico, as well as Europeans from Spain. So because of settler colonialism and the genocide of various American Indian groups and the taking of land, issues around American Indians are really issues of sovereignty, first and foremost, right? When we're talking about people who are Latine, it gets complicated because technically speaking, we have racialized this group, but it's really an ethnicity. And so you can have Afro-Latinas, right? People who are Black and of Latin American descent. You can have Asian Latinos, people who are Chinese and of Mexican descent, right? You can have white appearing, mestizo appearing, indigenous, browner appearing Latinx people. So the racial aspects of being Latin American are also a little bit complicated because you could be white passing or you could be Afro-Latino or, you know, I would say for Black Americans, for most Black Americans, but certainly not all Black Americans, there is, of course, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. But of course, that really depends on, and this is, again, this is a scholarly debate, but there are some people who identify very strongly with the term African American, but for them, that term means people who are descended from enslaved people in the Americas, and specifically in the antebellum South. That you could be enslaved, like Kamala Harris's family from Jamaica was enslaved in Jamaica in the Caribbean. So they were also subject to this transatlantic slave trade. But there are some people who don't consider Kamala Harris African American because she's a descendant of enslaved people from the Caribbean, not enslaved people from the United States. And the reason there's a distinction about this has to do with reparations, because there is a movement, the ADOS, let me put this in and you can Google it. So there's the ADOS movement, which stands for African Descendants of Slaves. And they are asking for reparations. So here in the Bay Area, they've actually asked for, I think it's $5 billion in reparations. But they make a distinction between if you're African American versus Black American. So for them, Kamala Harris should not receive reparations because she's a descendant of enslaved people from Jamaica. Again, Missy, I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but I guess I would say, like, I think, and again, I'm hesitant because I don't want to rank oppression, right? Because because being subject to white supremacy and being attacked for your racial or ethnic background is awful. But the way I experience an attack may be very different than some of my cousins. And I will say I have cousins that run the ethnic spectrum, right? In terms of racially how they appear. So it's different than what my cousin Wayne, who is much more racially ambiguous than I am. He has been mistaken at various times for being Mexican American, from being from the Middle East, from being mixed race Asian and Black. So his experiences are vastly different than mine. And he would be much more subject to be pulled over by the police, both based on his gender and on his racial appearance, right, than I would, as an East Asian American appearing woman who has gotten herself out of multiple traffic stops with police, right? Crying really helps, I have found, at least in the past. And I'm not trying to make light of that, but I'm trying to say that I have a very different racial and gender experience occupying an Asian American body. I don't get worried when I'm in a car. If I get pulled over by the police, I don't fear for my life. I have friends who fear for their lives. And I do think that's a qualitative difference with white supremacy that just needs to be acknowledged. And then the Harvard lawsuit. So I'll say this if people are waiting to kind of think about other questions. So the Harvard lawsuit is basically Harvard. So there's a group run by his name is Edward Blum. And I think it's Students for Fair, maybe it's Students for Fair Admissions. I think it's SFFA, Students for Fair Admission. So people may remember Abigail Fisher in the University of Texas Austin lawsuit that happened about 2 decades ago. That was Students for Fair Admission. And they lost, right? They went to the Supreme Court and Abigail Fisher lost her case. And so Edward Blum, this is a nefariously genius move. He decided, let's take race off the table. And so he thought, let's find an Asian American litigant who can sue various universities. So there's multiple lawsuits happening at the same time. It's not just Harvard. Harvard was the first. But it's actually a lawsuit that's also occurring against the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is where I previously taught, as well as some in the UC system. So it's basically alleging that Asian American applicants are being discriminated against within various state schools like Michigan, UNC Chapel Hill, UCLA, Harvard University, Yale, Princeton. Here's the thing, they have created the lawsuit before they have found the litigant. This in some senses is not unusual. This is actually what happened with Loving versus Virginia. Before, so Loving versus Virginia was the case that went to the Supreme Court that did away with anti-interracial marriage laws. There had been various challenges to various state laws preventing interracial marriages previous to the Lovings. But when they found the Loving case in Virginia, that's the case they decided to go up to the Supreme Court, to challenge the Supreme Court, because they were a good case, right? Heterosexual couple, attractive, family ties, and then of course the last name Loving. So there's a certain kind of pragmatic or cynical aspect to how lawsuits get kind of taken up in, for certain causes. And Blum and company want to dismantle affirmative action. And they think the way to do it is to use Asian Americans as a model minority to prove that there is discrimination happening, but that they can't be accused of being racist. The Harvard case is a little unusual or complicated because Harvard actually had been, and there's evidence of this in their own files, showing bias against Asian applicants because Harvard requires an in-person interview. And so those Asian applicants got rated lower when they had an in-person interview with someone. And so and the comments from these interviews were comments that, again, you would expect are stereotypes that adhere to Asian Americans, right? That they were not as that they weren't as socially adept, that they were a little robotic, that they seemed to be really good at math, but lacked certain social skills. And so it was shown that there was bias in the interview process. And I think that is probably likely the case, that that's true. Whether that then translates into discrimination of Asian applicants on the basis of to dismantle affirmative action is a separate entity itself. And so I would say politically savvy Asian American students at Harvard University have been careful in trying to tread this line of saying, yes, we recognize that Harvard likely discriminated against Asian applicants. We also recognize that this lawsuit being brought by Edward Blum is actually meant to dismantle affirmative action and will disproportionately harm Black and Latina and Native American applicants. I hope that helps. Does that help answer your question? Okay, cool. Anyone else? We got 7 minutes. Or somebody who just wants to make a comment. You are free to make a comment either live or in the chat. The other thing is that you could also disagree with me, right? Like, I'm just telling you about my own personal experiences, but like, you may know somebody who's Asian American or be Asian American identified yourself, and you will likely have a very different take than I have, which is totally fine. Hi, Petal.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your experience about your grandparents. So that is actually my background as well. So my grandmother is Chinese, and my family is from Trinidad. So I don't know much about like my history from that side, since she was pretty like estranged and separated from her family. But they grew up in Trinidad, and she married somebody who was Black, who was my grandfather. And then they had 3 sons from that. And then my mother is of Indian descent. So we're like West Indian. So then when they reproduced, we are all different skin tones. So like one of my brothers looks completely Puerto Rican, and like I'm in the middle of skin tone. And then I have 2 older siblings who are also darker, but it was just very uncommon for that to for me to meet people who had that background. So it's like very nice that I was able to like resonate with that, because I just had never met somebody before who had like any kind of similar background to that. So thank you again for sharing.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing your story too, Pebble. It's funny because I feel like if you talk to other people from the Caribbean, it's like no big deal, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're just like, oh yeah, of course you're Trinidadian. Yeah, or if I don't know if you've been to Trinidad,
I have, and there actually is like quite a big Chinese population there. I was there for 2 weeks, so it was like very common to see interracial relationships. And since I didn't grow up with that culture, me and my sister, we actually took Chinese in school. So she majored in it in college,
Oh,
and I
wow.
took it for 3 years. I might start learning it again since we might go to China together, but her husband is actually from Hong Kong and they plan to like raise their children like bilingually so that we can kind of get that culture back. Cause we know about like our Trinidadian, like in our Caribbean roots, but we really don't know anything about our Asian side. So we're trying to bring that back.
There's a really, I don't know if you know this film, there's a really wonderful film and I'm totally going to blank on it. So if you email me and I'll remember
Okay.
it, but it's a film about, so it's not a woman who grew up in Trinidad, but it's a woman who's very similar story to yours, right? Had a Chinese grandmother from Jamaica, right? And a Black grandfather, and then ended up living in New York City and then went searching for her Chinese roots. And actually they have this huge family reunion in China. Is this ringing a bell? I think it's called Searching for Mr. Lowe.
Okay.
Think
I
that's
will
what it's
definitely
called.
look that up, but
Yeah,
thank you so much again.
It's fascinating. It's and it might, it might also help just to watch that, even though it's Jamaica and not Trinidad, in terms of inspiring your own. I'm jealous. I took Mandarin twice and I dropped out twice because I just found it to be so
It's
difficult.
okay. I did it for 3 years and they were like, would you like to continue with it as like a language for college? And I was like, please no, I'm a little afraid. But it was a beautiful language. I still remember so much of it. When I lived with my sister and her husband, they made me speak it at home from here and there so that I wouldn't forget. So it's nice.
Cool. I know that there's 2 questions in the chat and I know we're at time. I'm happy to answer the questions in the chat if Marisha and Patricia don't mind. But if you have to leave, feel free to leave. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. And I'm happy to be in touch with everyone. Also, oh, there's one other plug I want to make before people leave. So technically speaking, this is only supposed to be for people in the College of Arts and Sciences, but honestly, we've had so few applications that I'm going to talk to Glenn and see if I can open it up to the university. So John Michael Rivera, who's the Dean for Arts and Humanities, and Kirk Ambrose, who's the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I got a grant from Glenn, the new Dean of the College of Arts and Science, to create a group called Racial Literacies. And the idea behind the group is that we would bring together students, staff, and faculty, about a group of 50 people, to come and read and research about race and racism, right? Ways to talk about race and racism, and that we would pay small stipends. So that's the form if you're interested, and you can read more about it. I'll be fully honest with you, we've only had 10 people sign up out of 50 slots. So we are definitely looking to have more people engaged. And if any of you are interested, please, consider clicking on that link and reading about it. So Tasha, I owe you an email. I'm so sorry. We should just text one another because my email inbox is out of control. So to answer your question about student employee activists on campus prioritizing advocacy work, I do think that there is an affinity group, a kind of nascent Asian American employee group that Glenn Asakawa has started along with some others. I don't know if anyone on this call has more information. And I think there are there's various levels of, I would say, student advocacy and engagement around social justice issues, but I'm not aware of any particular campaign. And I don't have a lot of knowledge of various Asian American groups, although I have worked with various Asian American students who are politically active. But my sense of things, and again, I'm happy to be corrected by anyone on this call, is that the Asian American student groups are not really politically active, like they're more kind of socially active, where they have various events that are more cultural, but less kind of politically engaged. And JS, to answer your question, the rise of Asian Americans voting for GOP candidates, I mean, to some degree, that's always been the case, right? That Asian Americans, like any other racial group, run the gamut of the political spectrum. Here's what's interesting, though. If you actually look at statistically how Asian Americans vote, starting in maybe 1980 and then moving forward to the latest election, the latest presidential election, in 2020, Asian Americans have been skewing Democrat for the last couple decades. And so I think Asian Americans voted, over 75% voted for Biden over Trump. 2020 may be a bit of an outlier year in many respects, given the kind of polarity that Donald Trump as a candidate, and especially, you know, everything that was happening around what he was saying about COVID-19. So, you know, we might have to put a pin in that year. But I think the narrative that Asian Americans are a conservative voting bloc is actually not quite the case. That if we looked at kind of Native American, Asian American, Latina, and Black Americans, Latina are actually the group that is going to vote more towards the GOP than Asian Americans. But Asian Americans are perceived to be more conservative than Latina people. There's probably a variety of reasons for that. And part of that has to do with the way that the census captures data, the way that people optically appear, right? Which is to say that you could be a white appearing Latino man, but look white, but actually identify as Latino, right? And part of that is kind of the notion that somehow Asian Americans are more conservative, that this again is a narrative that has been perpetuated again and again. So while it is true that there are some very conservative Asian Americans that are out there, in terms of a voting bloc, Asian Americans skew Democrat. But we're also talking about like over 30, you know, group of over 30 people. So again, you'd have to drill down and see that Indian, Chinese, and Filipino are maybe more conservative leaning, and Vietnamese, right? Those are the four groups that would be more leaning towards voting GOP over Japanese American, Korean Americans, or Nepalese, as an example. So yeah, I hope I answered that question. Okay. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. I only went 3 minutes over. So thank you, everybody, for sticking around.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. We're going to stop the recording if you want to hang by with Dr. Jennifer Ho.